The Ukrainians seem to have stabilized the front line along almost all parts of the front line. The Russians are mainly stopped. Wherever they do still advance, the advances are fairly minor. We'll talk about this as well as about another Russian warship going down in the Black Sea. Once again, Ukraine has destroyed a Russian Black Sea warship. And we have video evidence of the first HIMARS launcher actually being destroyed. Now, HIMARS are in usage by Ukraine for almost 2 years by now, and the Russians have claimed again and again that they have destroyed one of these launchers. Now we have video evidence of one actually being destroyed. We'll talk about this as well as about other developments along the front line and behind the respective front lines in this situation report. According to the Russian side, the Ukrainians did a drone attack on an oil depot at Feodosia. The Russians say 38 drones were used by the Ukrainians in this one attack. They claim they shot down 36, so only 2 came through, and those either missed the target completely or just damaged a pipeline, which would be an explanation for the fire that was observed. But at least according to Russian claims, the depot itself, so the storage itself, was not struck. I cannot confirm it. I just have the Russian claims from this side. The Russians themselves obviously also strike Ukrainian targets with Shahid, with cruise missiles, with ballistic missiles. Just recently, a few hours ago, there was a strike in Odessa where the Ukrainian Prime Minister was meeting his Greek colleague. The strike initially was reported to having been aimed at Zelensky's convoy, but this is seemingly not true. Even Zelensky himself didn't accuse the Russians, at least as of now, that they were aiming at him. So the strike was just aiming at Odessa. At least that's what we see right now. Ukrainian authorities are saying once more civilian casualties have been reported. This is basically the events over the last days and weeks. Russians keep striking in the Ukrainian rear, now and then causing civilian casualties. Smaller numbers, sometimes a little bigger numbers, but overall the air attacks have not intensified anymore, and the attacks in itself are somewhat limited over the last few weeks. When we go to the developments along the front line, I actually do not have that much to talk. Now, we have fighting north of the Seversky Donetsk, obviously, but whatever happened there, I do not see any confirmed change in territory. There are some fresh geolocalizations where some claims are that they moved the front line. I cannot confirm any of this. I do not see that anything has changed. The same is south of the Seversky Donetsk. Bilohorivka was another fresh round of fighting, but from what I've seen, the front line has not moved. The Russians, though, seem to have advanced somewhat inside of Ivanivske. They are holding still roughly half of the town, and they might have advanced somewhat in the western part of Ivanivske, but as of now, they definitely do not control the whole town. At least that's from what I see. Let's go to Avdiivka, because here the front line barely hasn't moved anymore as well. Now, in the last situation report, we talked that the Russians were in the southern part of Orlivka. Now we have geolocalization of them advancing somewhat here in the windbreaking tree line south of the town. They are now, at this point, they also managed to advance somewhat in the northeastern part of Orlivka, but overall not much has changed. Also, Semenivka and Berdychi are under pressure, but they themselves have not fallen as of yet. The Russians so far have not gained any significant additional advances here, but we'll talk about the overall situation there somewhat later. South of it, at Marinka, the Russians are advancing in the area of Marinka itself, or to the west of it. I mean, Marinka has already fallen. We have a pro-Ukrainian mill blogger here showing advances here in the windbreaker tree line in the north of Marinka, and here on the southern part of that water here, basically in this area, the Russians also advanced and gained some additional territory here and up here as well. In Novomikhailivka, the Russians have also been recently successful. There is a fresh geolocalization here inside of Novomikhailivka, at least a likely one, where the Russians again published a video now having basically entered the center of Novomikhailivka itself. In the last situation report, we had the Russians still in the south here. So we see additional advances inside of Novomikhailivka, but no breakthrough, no massive advance. And while the Russians keep up the pressure here, they also keep up the pressure at Pobieda. Overall, they have not achieved any bigger tactical success, even though Novomikhailivka is probably likely to fall over the next week or two. Further west, no change to be reported. At Vuhledar or south of Velika Novosilka, I cannot record any change in territory. And when it comes to the area south of Orikhiv, once again, I cannot confirm any change. Now, there are fresh reports of the Russians attacking roughly in this direction. And there are some claims that they have been successful here. I have not seen a geolocalization here. It would mean that they try to bypass Robotine and basically achieve a turning movement, force the Ukrainians to withdraw from Robotine, which to my knowledge is still, or once more, fully under Ukrainian control at this very moment. When we go to the developments on the Krinky front, on the Dnipro front, no change can be reported here either. I cannot confirm that anything has changed in this region as well. The bigger question was obviously over the last few days, will the Russians achieve an operational success over Avdiivka itself? Will they manage to even enter a movement war phase again? So will they be able to overcome the hastily set up fortifications west of Avdiivka? And at least for now, they cannot. The reasons for that seem to be somewhat obvious, though. Over the last few days, I think it might have been since the last situation report, three different M1 Abrams are confirmed to have been lost by the Ukrainians. That's 10% of their overall inventory. We also see a massive use of, for instance, M2 Bradleys by the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians use a bigger amount of mechanized equipment to fight back against the Russians at this point. It seems to be more or less obvious, especially as we have fresh confirmations of loss, for instance, from the HIMARS, which was in that region. We have attacks on a Gepard SPAA. We have a lot of artillery being struck over the last 10 days, more or less. It seems that the Ukrainians sent a lot of reinforcements to stop the Russians at this very point. This is not, in my opinion, this doesn't seem to be a confirmation that the fortification line here is solid enough to hold the Russians back. As we talked about in past situation reports, the Ukrainians themselves said that the fortifications haven't been prepared massively in advance. I just read recently that Ukrainians said from Salushny, the order came on December 1st to set up an additional line of defense behind Avdiivka. Until then, nothing was prepared, and even then, the efforts weren't very big. So the front line, we would have to expect that the Ukrainian fortifications behind these front lines are limited. Now, this leads to the Ukrainians doing the obvious thing. At least that's my interpretation out of this. They are throwing in a lot of personnel and material to stop the Russians where they are, to gain time. This, if the fighting is happening east of these towns, it will allow the soldiers on the high ground here to dig deeper, to create additional firing positions, to build connecting trenches, etc., to basically use their shovels and continue digging deeper during that time. And the lines further west, which are likely along this line here, those lines have more time to prepare as well. So this is not an assurance that the Russian advance is stopped for the time being. Might very well be, as soon as the Ukrainian reserves there are attrited, that the Russians keep advancing, but it might very well be that they are going to be stopped here for the time being, as obviously the Russians have suffered significant losses in the capture of Avdiivka, and at some point even the Russians will reach their culmination point, even though there are reports of fresh reserves being brought in, which would then prolong the time until this happens. Overall, the situation there seems to be stabilized for now. And as we've said in the other developments along the front line, basically there is no significant advance by the Russians, even though, for instance, in Novomikhailivka, they gained a few meters. For the time being, the Ukrainians seem to have been successful to stop the Russians. We'll have to see, obviously, how it continues. And if you don't want to miss this, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Let's go over to the Black Sea. Here we have another report of a Russian warship being sunk. Now, this was roughly south here of the Strait of Kerch. The Ukrainians destroyed the warship, a Project 22160 class Sergei Kotov. This was, we see here the drones advancing towards the ship and striking it. The ship initially was heavily damaged and the Russians tried to tow it into safety, but in overall it didn't work out. You can see here, this video is supposedly from another boat recording the fighting there, where the Russians, where the Sergei Kotov tried to defeat or try to defend itself against the naval drones. And that is supposedly the hit where it was then hit by the first naval drone. And as said, as of now, the Russians themselves confirm that it was sunk. The GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, believes 52 crew members were saved by the Russians, but 7 have fallen in the attack by the Ukrainians. The ship itself is classified as a patrol boat, but it's basically a corvette, and it can be equipped with up to 8 caliber cruise missiles that have been intensively used against Ukraine. So once more, this really will help Ukraine reduce the pressure from cruise missiles, at least in regards to the Black Sea Fleet. Usually there's also a Kamov 27 on board. I have not seen any visual confirmation. There are claims that the helicopter went down with the ship, which would increase the damage, but this is probably not decisive in the overall picture. There's also been a Ukrainian, at least likely Ukrainian attack on a railroad bridge in Samara. Samara is somewhere here. The railroad bridge was hit. We have claims though that the bridge is now again under operation, even though on just one lane. And as we see the GOR reporting it, it seems likely that it was one of their partisans or saboteurs that has tried to block the resupply of Russians to attack Russian infrastructure in this regard. And very fresh news right before the recording started from Berdyansk here, we have the report from the Russian side that a member of the Electoral Commission in Berdyansk, where the Russian presidential election will be held to, in a few weeks, in I think less than 2 weeks, one of the members of the Electoral Commission has been killed in a car bombing in Berdyansk, likely planted by a bomb planted by Ukrainian partisans. In troop generation, we have some weird news. Now we have this claim here. Those are supposedly Indians that went on vacation and then were lured to Belarus, and then they didn't they got stuck, and then they were handed some paperwork in Russian, probably Cyrillic, and they signed it to just find out that it was recruitment paper for the Russian armed forces, and now they're being sent to attack Ukrainian positions after just 15 days of training. I have no way of checking if this is true. If what they are saying is actually true is the first question, and then if those are actually Indians that never signed up voluntarily is completely unknown. So we should summarize this as a rumor of a potential recruitment, but not more. I don't see that this would be proof of this practice being done by the Russians, at least as of yet. The Russians also published pictures and videos about their Shahid factory, and we can see that it looks pretty impressive if we see the scale of the production here. Obviously, we have mass production that is being done here, and this is from this factory that the Russians built in Tatarstan. We talked about this here on the channel over the past year or year and a half, that the Russians were building a factory, and as we can see, it not just started production, but it's starting large-scale production as well. Then we have a claim. This is a German journalist for Der Spiegel, and according to him, Laura Solanko from the Finnish from the Central Bank of Finland has checked data from Russia, and she found out that since the partial mobilization, the amount of money in private bank accounts in Russia went up significantly, and in a degree that would not be justified by just regular savings or anything like this. And they come to the conclusion that a lot of it is money that is paid to Russian citizens after their son has fallen in the war in Ukraine. And the conclusion they come to, as they receive 5 million ruble, or the equivalent of more or less 50,000 euros, probably $53,000. This would mean that whoever dies with 35 at the front line is giving more money to his relatives in comparison to if he keeps working until the time of his retirement, as the local wages are so low that basically his death price is higher than what he could earn doing an honest working a local job. Now, I have no way of confirming the conclusion, but this would be a sign and a hint how much the Russian recruitment effort still has the opportunity to advance. Because obviously, if you know that if you survive and you are fine, you're getting the fairly high wage as a Russian soldier. But if you die, you made sure that your family is being taken care of better than you ever could. This will entice a lot of Russian citizens volunteering to fight along the front line, purely from financial means as well, disregarding other potential like propaganda, like patriotism, etc. Another sign how and why the Russian volunteer recruitment keeps meeting not just their demands, but going somewhat over it, which is even confirmed by the Ukrainian side. Basically, everyone confirms that the Russians are recruiting enough to make up their losses during the last year and a half. Then we have a picture here from a then we have a Telegram picture here. No, according to this Ukrainian mail blogger, there have been seen OF-56IM-1P 155 122 millimeter shells in Ukraine being used by the Russians. As of now, it's unclear where they have been produced, whether the Chinese, this is a Chinese type of 122 that has an increased range. By now, it's unclear whether it was produced by the Russians, basically just license producing a better shell, or whether the Chinese actually started production and not marking the shells according to the final user, which would obviously be a dramatic news for Ukraine if the Chinese had started to supply the Russians with ammunitions as well. So far, there were some reports of Chinese aid, obviously non-military and dual use, a lot of it. There are those buggies that are being used for assaults by the Russians, and there were claims by Chinese companies that they have sent body armor was sold, but also several thousand hunting rifles, which are more sniper rifles, have also been sold into Russia. But as said, the claim was it was hunting rifle, but official military offensive support weapons and shells that are designated for military use have so far not been recorded. This might now be the first case where directly Chinese weapons have come there. We've seen other Chinese weapons in Ukraine, but those were from Albanian stocks, so they were handed to the Ukrainian side actually. So we'll have to keep an eye on this. If this actually turns out that the Chinese started their ammunition production for the Russians as well, that would be dramatic news not for the good of Ukraine. Then we have news from the Telegraph. Now, the British Telegraph newspaper wrote an article according to which Kadyrovtsi, they talked to a former prisoner of war of the Ukrainians, and he was sold to the Chechens, to the Kadyrovtsi, to allow them to exchange him with a Kadyrovtsi, with a Chechen that the Ukrainians had taken as a prisoner of war. So basically there is some market inside Russia among the different armed formations where they exchange Ukrainian prisoners of war as a good that can be traded, and the Kadyrovtsi was buying him to get one of their own back. And that leaves us with the obvious conclusion: either they are being disregarded by the official military exchanges, that if Kadyrovtsi are being caught, they are not being exchanged, or that the Kadyrovtsi lose far more as own prisoners of war than they capture Ukrainian ones, so they need to fill up their numbers. And this would be somewhat surprisingly, as the Russians are mostly on the offensive and should thus capture more prisoners of war than the other way around. And that would be another indication to judge the effectiveness of the Kadyrovtsi in this war, which have received the nickname from Western observers as the TikTok warriors, as they are famous for presenting a lot of TikTok videos where the actual tactical use, where the actual effectiveness of what they shoot at is more than just questionable. There are videos, for instance, where they shoot turning lights to impress the audience, I guess. In the political sphere, we have an interesting picture. Now, this is Dmitry Medvedev, who was at the Russian Youth Festival. where he talked about Russia's geographic and strategic borders. He insisted that, of course, Ukraine is a part of Russia at this event, and he was standing in front of this map, as you can see here, where Ukraine is basically completely divided up. Apart from Kiev Oblast, the western part is mostly given to Poland. This is given to, I think this should be, this is given to Hungary, and this is given to Romania. Again, somebody showing what Ukraine is supposed to negotiate with, because while Medvedev is acting like a dog on rabies over the last 1.5 years, at the same time he's still the official party leader of United Russia, the party that is Putin's party effectively, and he's at the same time he's also the deputy head of the National Security Council. So he's not just some rogue that is without any influence. He's, as you will know, a former Russian president as well. He's presenting this map as a future of Ukraine and showing us where at least some parts in the Russian establishment, in the Russian leadership, see the negotiation potential. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash and the former commander of the Black Sea Fleet, Admiral Viktor Sokolov. The first one is the commander, or was the commander, of the long-range air units. Both are being both have their arrest warrant issued by the ICC for attacking civilian infrastructure. And we have news from international support. Now, first of all, I can now confirm that Javier Milei has actually transferred 2 Mi-171Es from Argentina to Ukraine, which should be the first military aid that is confirmed to have come from Latin America towards Ukraine. And I think in the last situation report I mentioned that he plans to have a summit to gain more military aid for Ukraine. Also, there are rumors that the Bulgarians are currently pulling out 122mm self-propelled howitzers of the type Gvozdika and BRDM-2 recon cars, armored cars, out of their depot. The only likely goal for those weapons to be delivered is obviously the Ukraine, so they might receive some additional artillery and lightly armored cars in the near future. Then we have news from Germany, the producer of the Taurus, which is a big political debate in Germany, as most of you will probably have followed. The producer said it's not a problem to train the Ukrainians to handle it themselves, so no German soldiers will be needed. No German soldier has to be in place. This is what the German chancellor is using to justify not sending Ukraine, and now basically everyone who knows about the topic is calling him a liar by now, whether directly or just in acts. And they also said they can restart production at any time, so the lack of Taurus won't be a long-term issue for Germany there as well. Then we have news that Germany participated significantly, that's the term that was used, in financing of the artillery shells that were found by the Czech Republic. 800,000 shells in 152 and 122, so the Soviet calibers, and the rumors are that the majority of them are financed now after several countries have pitched in. Germany supposedly also pitched in with a 3-digit million number, so Ukraine should receive the first big lots of additional artillery shells within weeks. That's good news for them, obviously. Then we have 2 videos of the first reported HIMARS strikes. Those are the guided bombs that are also have rocket assisted propellant. Those are, I guess you could call it something like a JDAM equivalent of the French Republic, and they have been used now against Russia, and we see the first examples of them here in Kosachi Laheri, so along the Dnipro, and here close to in Avdiivka. That should be the coke plant, if I'm not completely wrong. The French have said said a couple of months ago that they are going to give the Ukrainians 50 of those per month. Obviously, we're talking about 50 to 100 gliding bomb attacks by the Russians, which usually have a much bigger warhead, but still, at least there we see some aid and some usage of the Ukrainians in this context. And finally, we have the first video of a lost HIMARS. We can see it here. clearly identifiable as a HIMARS, and it is with resupply vehicles and probably a guidance. And here is the hit on its position. This is reported by the Russians to have been used in Iskander. That was used, and it struck the HIMARS more than 30 kilometers behind the front line in the area of Avdiivka. Also, another important first thing, not really first, we've had another strike before against a Ukrainian Gepard, even though the hit likely only slightly damaged it. Here we see that it's likely as much more significant damage, and this is identifiable as a Gepard. You can clearly see the 35mm turrets here. You can see the 7 road wheels, and this is the observation radar, and this is the tracking radar. So this is without any doubt in my mind, this is a Gepard that was hit here by a Russian Lancet drone. Then we have an example of the Russians being fooled by the Ukrainians. Here we see supposedly local workshops building dummies, in this case a D-20 howitzer, as you can see from probably PVC pipes and some metal parts, probably old car tires. You see that this is a tire that is probably no longer under normal use, being used here to basically draw in Russian fire and thus save the real artillery pieces in this context. And that was it from me for now. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment what you think about the current situation. Do you think the Russians will be able to reinvigorate their offensive, do you think? Or do you think the Ukrainians will be able to hold the front line close to Avdiivka for longer? And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.